Morning. So today we're talking about self-realization. What is self-realization? And there is two basic distinctions that we need to make in order to open up a new possibility of understanding what that means. The first one, let's take realization. There is a big distinction between realization and understanding. Realizing something and understanding something. These days, there's so much information available that everybody understands everything, don't they? Everybody knows everything, particularly in the spiritual realm. Everybody understands the concepts that underwrite experiences of the spiritual world. Everybody knows about the self. They understand it, but it doesn't bring them the experience of the self. Understanding how a car works doesn't bring you the experience of driving in it and being transported by it. So understanding is overrated. What we need is realization. Realization. Realization comes from a direct experience. You yourself see something, experience something, and from that your own realization grows. If I have a realization of the self, I speak about it to you. It won't make you realize it. My realization is for me. Your realization is for you. Me talking about my realization might make you understand it, that it's a possibility, that such a thing does exist, but it won't in itself give it to you. That has to arise within you from your own seeing. So realization means when you get it. You can understand the concepts of something and still not get it. Getting something, what does that mean? Getting something means when you energetically get the knowingness of it, beyond the concept of it. You actually get the knowingness or the experience or the realization of it. It becomes real for you. What was a concept, what was a possibility, becomes real. It becomes realized in you. It becomes yours. The concepts that we have that form our understandings, they can be forgotten or they can be lost, and they can change. But what we realize through direct experience ourselves, that becomes part of us. It's on a deeper level than memory. Understanding is stored in memory. Realization is of the heart. The heart realizes, in the sense that I'm talking about it here. So that's the distinction. We're not looking to understand anything new. All our understandings, where have they got us? What we need is realization. We need direct experience. Now, the other word that we're looking at is self-realization. So what is the self? And the distinction here we have to make is between the part that we play in our life, what we do, what we think, our states of consciousness, our relationships, our sex, are we male, are we female, are we other, our age, our job, our opinions, our experiences, our life story, the part we play, what our name represents. Oh, Tim, he's like this, he does this, he's done that, this is who he is, the part that I play. That's not the self. Neither is the self the psychological part of me. The psychological self is not the self. The psychological self is the place where all the ideas and conclusions that you've drawn about yourself when referring to thinking to answer the question, who am I? What you come up with is the psychological self. It contains unresolved stuff that you just haven't understood or got. It contains all your qualities, it contains fears, it contains neuroses, psychoses, habits, all kinds of stuff. But it's all made of thought. And the psychological self appears as me, but it isn't me. I think I am who I think I am. And that is not who I am. So the distinction here is between the psychological self, or the part that I play in this movie of life, and the self, which is other than that. Now, in almost every case, the part that you play in life, the role that you're acting out, father or lover or brother or whatever your job is, that's the role you're acting out. In almost every case, it's not really very pleasant being that, identifying as that. And that is why we need a realization of the self, in order that we can disentangle from identifying as the psychological self, which is the part we're playing in the movie of life. Now, the self is amazing, because the self, the true self that we actually are, the deepest, truest part of us, is not wounded. It has not been wounded or broken or upset or lost or scratched or broken by the traumas and dramas and karmas of the life we've lived. It remains untouched. It remains pure. It remains whole. Nothing touches it. We could equate the self with the sky in some ways. The sky may be the domain in which a great storm takes place, with lightning and fierce winds and all kinds of intense activity. But does it change the sky when the storm has passed, or even while the storm is happening? Is the sky touched by what happens in it? No, it's not. The sky is separate and different from the weather, just as the self is distinct from what happens in it. And what happens in the self are states of consciousness, which are transitory. They come, they go. Thoughts, the same. They come, they go. Feelings arise, emotions arise, energies arise. And they come and go. That's also like weather. And then drama itself changes all the time, comes and goes. And that is weather. That happens where? In the self, which is sky-like. It doesn't change. Without the sky, nothing would have a place to be. Without the self, there would be nowhere for the experience of this life to take place. Self-realization isn't the most important thing, because until we realize the self, we are identifying with something that's going to cause us suffering. Identifying as the psychological self, you will suffer, because you will perceive yourself as needing to be fixed in some way, as something not being right. But it never really gets fixed. You don't find people going around saying, I'm completely fixed psychologically. It never happens, because it's unfixable. It's endless, the fixing of the psychological self. And it's not the pathway to knowledge, to self-knowledge, knowledge of the self, which brings self-realization. Now, this happens not in the intellect. It happens somewhere else. It happens in consciousness. We've been given the gift of consciousness, and we can direct that consciousness anywhere we like. Consciousness, of course, is always changing. Consciousness disappears when we sleep. In deep, dreamless sleep, there's no consciousness at all. We have this sense I, and from that consciousness arises. We get to choose where we direct that consciousness. If we direct it into things that are going to pass, if we look for what our heart is in where it isn't, then we will suffer. Where is the optimum place to direct your consciousness, this gift of consciousness? And the answer is into awareness. Bringing our consciousness to the level of awareness, and then joy, bliss, peace is realized as the quality of the sky. It doesn't come and go, it doesn't change. Awareness doesn't come and go, it's always there. It doesn't evolve, it doesn't move. There's no such thing as my awareness. There's my consciousness, but there's no such thing as my awareness. Awareness is one, pervading everything, always, already. Waking up is when I bring my consciousness out of the psychological self, out of identifying as the part I'm playing in the movie of life, and bringing into awareness. So I lift my consciousness into awareness. And how do I do that? What actually triggers self-realization? If you meet someone who has had that awakening and is that awakening, then that can be extremely helpful in triggering your own awakening. Failing that, because it's not everybody's fate to have that, the lucky ones perhaps meet someone who is like that, and by engaging with them, something incredible happens, an awakening starts to unfold within them. But otherwise, if you haven't had that good fortune, then if you simply put everything else down, this will bring you to a place where your consciousness and awareness are one. Taking your consciousness out of the body. You're not interested in the body is the vehicle. Taking your consciousness out of your life drama for a moment. Taking your consciousness out of the role that you're playing. Taking your consciousness out of considerations of the past and of the future. Taking your consciousness out of your emotional world. Taking your consciousness out of your thoughts. You're not interested in your thoughts. So much thinking. What has it brought? Taking your consciousness out of your life and putting everything down. What remains then is this beautiful sky-like awareness. And there it's realized where consciousness actually came from. That consciousness is an expression of this unchanging awareness. And when you bring the two together, it is the natural state. It's always been happening. The self is not in your head. The self is housed, if you like, in your heart. The sense of you being an entity, what's known in Hindu terms, Vedic terms, as Atman, is housed in your heart. When you finally bring your consciousness back into the Atman, then you have this exquisite sense of being a self. And then as you go into that, surrendering into that, you realize the great mystery of I am that I am. And that your sense of self, not the part you're playing, the ego self, but the deep part absolute sense of self is amazingly one and the same with what we could call the overself, which holds all of life. And this experience, which I haven't described very well, because it's actually impossible to turn it into a thing, to reify it, it's inconceivable in its majesty, in its glory. It can't be described. Otherwise then you'd imagine it and think you'd had it, and that wouldn't be it. Because it's not imagined, it's not an object. It's there when everything else is put down. It's the ground of being. And it's profound peace. It's profound silence. When your consciousness returns to that simplicity, it does so in profound silence. Not just no noise, but profound silence. That silence which is so extraordinary that it could really only be determined, it could really only be called sacred, divine. Because in that silence, something is felt so powerfully. The majesty and the beauty and the love from which life comes. So self-realization is something that we can have. And it starts with realizing that you're not the part you're playing. In the part you're playing, you might have suffering. Now, someone's just asked a question here, what about the teaching of selflessness? Easy, wonderful. In order to get to the place of what I'm calling the self, you have to let go of and put down the self that you were identifying as, which in this case was the ego, the part you were playing, who you thought you were. Put that self down, become selfless, and you will realize the true self. But remember, the true self is not a thing. It's inconceivable. But you can, by putting everything down, arrive in that place and get it as the self. The words cause the confusion. Selflessness is there when you experience the self. And the self that has gone is the small self, who you thought you were in the absence of the knowledge of the true self. But it's not a thing. Now these are like riddles, but it becomes clear as you choose to know, as you choose to know the self. So people often say that there is a big difference between Hinduism and Buddhism, because Buddhism says no self and Hinduism talks of the self. But the Dalai Lama, I've heard him myself speak, he said this is not people understanding what is meant correctly. There is no difference. They're very similar. And also I sat with the Ajahn Sumedho, who is a great Theravadin master, in Ramana Maharshi's meditation room. And then he spoke afterwards saying exactly the same thing. That when Buddhists say there is no self, what they mean is there is no substantially existing thing as the self. Now, for something to be called real, it has to have certain qualities. It has to be born of something real. It has to have an edge that is separate from everything else. It has to be independent and has to have no constituent parts. There is no self that has those qualities. but you experience the sense of self on the way to realizing the absolute wonder of the total self. In the first stage, self-realization comes as a simple feeling, I am. I've come out of the chaotic city that I built of my ego self, and I've come into the beautiful place where the simple sense, I am, resonates. And there I return to peace. There I'm clear. There is love. And in the deepest, profoundest peace, even that then opens and dissolves. And I have no longer a point from which I view. I am then one with self-cognizing awareness. The great self. I am that I am. But first, to have self-realization in the sense of, wow, I'm not who I thought I was. I'm not the thinker. I'm not the ego self. I'm not the part I play. I'm not what my name represents. That there's something deeper and more wonderful than that, which is the simple sense, I am. And then from there, something even more wonderful happens. So, it sounds complicated, and I haven't really expressed it very well, but it is a possibility for everyone to know thyself. Know thyself. When the great philosopher, I think it was Plato or Socrates, said, know thyself, he didn't mean be fully conversant with all the psychological aspects, your character traits, be conversant with all the different ways that you express yourself. That isn't what he meant by know thyself. Know the self. Know the self is the most important thing. Because if you don't know the self, you're identifying as something that will inevitably cause you suffering. But if you realize the self, if you come to know the self, and flow as that through this life, you will have a golden pathway. That you will see things as they actually are, and not as you currently see them, which is our perceptions are clouded by who we're being that life is, which gives us all kinds of extraordinary answers. But when we are what we are, then we see it as it is. And how it is heavenly. So, choose, say yes, to return to that simplicity. And returning to that place, the simple sense I am, that beautiful place within the heart. And a whole other journey starts from there. But that is the awakening, the shift out of identifying with the mind and recognizing that there's something really much more amazing behind the personality, behind the thinking, behind the persona, behind the psychological self. You will find the self. And then by investigating that, it becomes, and you realize it as sky-like, unchanging, sky-like, all-pervading. The highest and best we can do in this life is to realize the self as love, unconditional, all-pervading love. And then even just breathing, you're breathing in not just energy or prana, you're breathing in love and letting out love in a field of love. Our highest identity in forms is that of being a lover, one who is in the field of love, which is the highest reality. So it's so wonderful. It's so wonderful to be feeling that presence of the self, the presence of the self. When you're in your mind, you flow along as a waveform, but as soon as you self-observe, you break down into particle presence and feel what it is to be here now, actually, rather than be flowing along in a fantasy of who you think you are. And you can do that very quickly. The awakening to the self, which brings self-realization, how far away is it? It's as far away as who you're being that its distance is. How far away you're being that it is, that's how far away it is for you. There is no distance that it is from you. It's right here, right now, always. When you put everything else down, what remains, you are that. Self-realization. That's your purpose. That's your destination. That's you living in your optimum possibility path. That's the path where you are realizing the self. And out of that comes your service, your mission, and you are fully effective. So, a couple more minutes to go, just to wish you that. I hope that something that I've said has resonated with you. Maybe lots of it hasn't, but maybe something has. Because you do know who you are. But it's not a set of qualities. It's not a character. It's not a collection of wounds. Constantly assessing your psychological state will not bring you self-knowledge. It doesn't really help to be constantly assessing your psychological state. It just perpetuates a nonsense and a cause of suffering. What you need to know, you will know. Focus on the self by being present in this moment. When you bring your consciousness to presence, you start to revelate. Insights come, and you start to see what is, and what has always been, and what will always be. That which was never born and will never die. You were that. You don't have to be clever to see this. You just have to be alive.